Canada has just made a move that has the United States scrambling. A quiet, calculated shift that could reroute $780 billion in agricultural trade right out of American hands. Imagine this. A forgotten Arctic port, neglected for decades, suddenly becomes the centerpiece of global power, cutting thousands of kilometers off the route to Europe and bypassing U.S. ports entirely. Logistics companies that once held control are now left watching billions slip away. And this isn't speculation, and it's happening right now, and the consequences could reshape not just Canadian agriculture, but the balance of food and fertilizer supply across the entire world. In the next few minutes, we're going to break down how a single port, a bold corporate strategy, and decades of overlooked infrastructure are quietly rewriting global trade, and why the U.S. may never regain control. It all started with a shock to the system that few saw coming. President Trump's tariffs on Canadian grain and fertilizers weren't just a political maneuver. They were a wake-up call for the entire agricultural world. Suddenly, farmers in Saskatchewan and Alberta were forced to ask a question they had never truly considered. Why was their grain and fertilizer still moving through American ports when a faster, cheaper route to Europe existed right in their backyard? That question came not from a politician or corporate boardroom, but from Mark Carney, who directly challenged prairie farmers in March 2025. He asked, why were Canadian producers paying U.S. logistics firms, accumulating fees at every turn when an Arctic port built decades ago for exactly this purpose sat idle? Those words exposed a system quietly draining Canada's control and profits for years. And then the response was immediate. Canadian companies began rerouting shipments through the Port of Churchill, a long-forgotten deep-water gateway in Hudson Bay. Grain, fertilizer, and critical exports that once passed through congested Vancouver or U.S. rail networks were now bypassing American infrastructure entirely. Within weeks, this was no longer a minor adjustment. It was a structural disruption, a direct threat to U.S. leverage over North America's most valuable agricultural corridor, impacting billions of dollars in trade and signaling a dramatic shift in power. The U.S., for decades accustomed to controlling this flow, suddenly found itself on the outside, watching Canada reclaim control of its own resources. And this is just the beginning. Because the consequences for global food supply, fertilizer markets, and international trade are far bigger than most realize. In the next layer, we'll dive into why this abandoned Arctic port, long ignored and underestimated, became the key to Canada's $780 billion play. To understand why this move is so explosive, we have to go back decades to a port that most Canadians had forgotten even existed. The Port of Churchill, built in the 1930s as Canada's northern gateway to Europe, was supposed to be a crown jewel of trade. Deep water access, rail connections, and a strategic location made it ideal for cutting thousands of kilometers off shipments. But over time, neglect took over. By the early 2000s, Churchill had become little more than a curiosity. Cargo volumes were tiny, seasonal access limited, and political attention virtually non-existent. Maintenance lagged, investment dried up, and in 1997, the Canadian government sold the port and its 1,300-kilometer rail line to a private American company for just $1. $1. That price wasn't a mistake. It reflected a long-held belief that this infrastructure had little strategic value. Flooding in 2017 finally sealed its fate for a time. The rail line was destroyed, the port went silent, and the Arctic Gateway, the shortcut that could have transformed Canadian exports, was abandoned. Meanwhile, Vancouver and U.S. ports became the default, congested, expensive routes, funneling fees and control into American hands. Canadian grain and fertilizer passed through U.S. railroads and terminals, adding layers of cost while the true potential of Churchill went untapped. But here's the twist. What the world ignored for decades is now exactly what gives Canada leverage. That abandoned port, once dismissed as irrelevant, has become the key to breaking free from U.S. dominance in agriculture. The irony is stark. Years of neglect created the perfect opportunity for a bold, strategic pivot. And make no mistake, this isn't just about shipping. It's about control, sovereignty, and billions of dollars in leverage. Next, we'll uncover the immediate economic impact. The billions of dollars rerouted, the industries affected, and why this disruption has the U.S. panicking behind the scenes. The moment Canadian companies started rerouting grain and fertilizer through Churchill, the economic landscape shifted overnight. We're not talking small numbers here. We're talking about a potential $780 billion in agricultural trade moving out of U.S. control. Billions of dollars that once flowed through American ports and logistics companies are now staying in Canada, building domestic leverage and undermining decades of U.S. dominance. Fertilizer shipments from Saskatchewan that used to pass through U.S. railroads, paying fees at every step, are now reaching Europe faster, cheaper, and with zero American involvement. Grain exports, including wheat, canola, and specialty crops, are following the same path. For years, the U.S. profited from inefficiency, ports congested, shipping delayed, fees piling up. That advantage is gone. And the timing couldn't be more dramatic. Trump's tariffs, meant to protect domestic markets, inadvertently accelerated Canada's pivot. By threatening up to 25% tariffs on grain and applying pressure on fertilizer exports, the U.S. forced Canadian producers to ask a critical question: why rely on someone else when we can control our own destiny? This is more than just lost fees. It's lost leverage, lost influence, and a warning shot to the U.S. government and logistics firms that Canada can operate independently and profit massively doing it. The immediate impact is clear. Billions redirected, American control weakened, and a long overlooked Arctic port now positioned at the center of global agricultural power. But this disruption is only the surface. Behind it lies a web of strategic maneuvers, hidden agendas, and corporate calculations that most people never see. Next, we'll dive into the hidden agendas and elite maneuvers that turned a forgotten port into the epicenter of a global power shift. What most people don't see is that this isn't just a logistics story. It's a calculated power play. Behind the scenes, companies like Genesis Fertilizers and the Arctic Gateway Group orchestrated a bold strategy. By centering operations around the Port of Churchill, they didn't just cut shipping distances, they bypassed the U.S. entirely, taking control of billions in trade that had flowed through American infrastructure for decades. And make no mistake, this move was deliberate, not accidental. The leadership framed it as empowerment through control, a strategic decision that strengthens Canada's autonomy, stabilizes supply chains, and locks out foreign influence. Every ton of fertilizer rerouted, every container of grain shipped through Hudson Bay sends a clear message. Canada no longer needs to rely on the U.S. to reach global markets. Trump's tariffs, meant to extract concessions, had the opposite effect. They revealed vulnerabilities in U.S.-Canadian trade dependence, and elite Canadian actors exploited that window with precision. What looked like a minor operational shift was, in reality, a coordinated realignment of global agricultural power, executed quietly but with devastating long-term consequences for U.S. leverage. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because Canada's next move involves more than fertilizer. It's about controlling the flow of food and critical resources worldwide, and that brings us to the true scale of their power. To grasp the stakes, you have to understand the scale of Canadian agriculture. Canada isn't just a supplier, it's a global powerhouse. Saskatchewan alone produces wheat shipped to over 80 countries, while Alberta dominates canola production. Potash, a critical ingredient for fertilizers worldwide, accounts for 41% of global exports, sustaining food for nearly half the planet. Now imagine that supply suddenly bypassing the U.S., moving directly through Canadian-controlled infrastructure. The ripple effects are enormous. Faster deliveries, lower costs, more reliability for buyers, and an unprecedented concentration of power in Canadian hands. The U.S., which long profited from logistical dependence, is now sidelined, watching as billions in trade and influence quietly shift north. This is not theoretical. Canadian firms are already executing these routes, and the math is staggering. Grain, fertilizer, specialty crops, all moving through Churchill, are solidifying Canada's position at the center of global food supply. When I examine this, I see not just a policy adjustment, but a strategic recalibration with worldwide consequences. This is a nation quietly asserting dominance, while the rest of the world reacts to a play most didn't even see coming. And the consequences don't stop at economics. The political, strategic, and even symbolic implications are enormous. The full impact is only now beginning to emerge. In the next section, we'll explore how this port has become a symbol of sovereignty, strategy, and long-term global influence. This port is more than just infrastructure. It has become a symbol of power, sovereignty, and strategic foresight. For decades, the Port of Churchill was overlooked, a relic of the past, dismissed as irrelevant. Yet today, it represents a calculated reclaiming of control, a statement that Canada can dictate the flow of food, fertilizer, and critical resources without relying on foreign systems. Every container leaving Churchill isn't just a shipment, it's a message. It signals that logistics, trade routes, and supply chains are not just operational tools, they are levers of power. Countries, corporations, and political leaders who once assumed dominance are suddenly reminded that influence can shift overnight. A single port, when leveraged correctly, can alter global supply, economic flows, and geopolitical balance. And there's a historical echo here. Think back to the Arctic trade routes of the 20th century, when Canada's northern gateways were meant to connect the world. They were underutilized, neglected, and underestimated, until now. By resurrecting Churchill, Canada isn't just fixing old infrastructure, it's asserting strategic intent, reshaping decades of trade patterns, and sending a message that long-term vision beats short-term convenience every time. The symbolism extends further. For U.S. policymakers, it's a wake-up call. Tariffs, threats, and decades of influence are no longer guarantees. For global markets, it's a reminder that control over food and fertilizer supply is as much about geography and investment as it is about politics. And for Canada, it's a quiet demonstration of power without aggression, influence without conflict, and sovereignty through strategy. Even the most brilliant strategy comes with risks, and the Port of Churchill is no exception. Canada may have reclaimed control, but the Arctic environment is unforgiving. Permafrost is melting, rail lines face flooding, sinkholes and washouts, and icebreakers are required to extend the shipping season. Every shipment through this northern route carries the weight of logistical uncertainty. One misstep could disrupt billions in trade. Then there's the political dimension. While Canada strengthens its autonomy, U.S. policymakers are not idle. Tariffs, trade negotiations, and diplomatic pressure could still shift dynamics in ways that companies cannot fully predict. Operating independently in a system long dominated by external influence requires constant vigilance. A single miscalculation could erode the very leverage Canada has fought to regain. Investment risk is another factor. Upgrading a port built in the 1920s to modern standards requires hundreds of millions in capital, plus long-term commitments to infrastructure, housing, and community support. Private companies like Genesis Fertilizers are betting big, and failure is not an option. One unforeseen natural disaster, market shift, or policy change could slow the entire corridor, threatening billions in redirected trade. Yet even with these risks, the move is audacious, a calculated gamble that elevates Canadian sovereignty and reshapes global agricultural power. Every challenge underscores the stakes. This isn't just about shipping grain, it's about asserting control over resources, influence, and long-term strategy in a world where leverage is everything. Next, we'll explore the future outlook, how this corridor could redefine Canada's role on the global stage, and what it means for U.S. influence in the years to come. Looking ahead, the Port of Churchill is poised to reshape global agriculture and trade for decades. As grain, fertilizer, and specialty crops continue to bypass U.S. routes, Canada is solidifying a new era of autonomy. Markets in Europe, Asia, and beyond are now increasingly dependent on Canadian-controlled supply chains, faster, cheaper, and more reliable than before. This isn't just a Canadian victory, it's a wake-up call to the United States. The influence once held by American ports, railroads, and logistics firms is eroding. Long-term leverage over the world's food supply is shifting north, and Washington is left watching as billions of dollars, control, and geopolitical advantage quietly slip out of its hands. The ripple effects extend beyond agriculture. By demonstrating that control over infrastructure equates to control over outcomes, Canada is sending a signal to every global power. Strategy, foresight, and investment outweigh short-term dominance. Nations that ignored Arctic potential for decades now see its strategic significance, and private companies are following suit, creating a network of influence that may define global trade for a generation. But this is just the beginning. With further investments in ports, icebreakers, and northern railways, the potential for year-round shipping opens doors to new industries, expanded markets, and stronger national resilience. Canada has turned a forgotten port into a centerpiece of long-term global strategy, and the world is only starting to take notice. When I examine this, it becomes clear the story of the Port of Churchill is more than logistics. It's power, sovereignty, and strategy in motion. A forgotten Arctic gateway has transformed into a $780 billion corridor, bypassing decades of dependency and forcing the United States and the world to recalibrate their assumptions about control, influence, and leverage. The lesson here is profound. Infrastructure isn't just concrete and steel, it's a tool of power. Markets, trade, and geopolitics hinge on who controls the flow of resources, and Canada just rewrote the rules. The next decade will show how far this bold strategy will reach and how nations respond when the tables of global influence are flipped. If you want to stay ahead of the global shifts that most people don't see, subscribe to State Brief and turn on notifications. Every development, every pivot, and every power play in agriculture, trade, and politics will be covered, because understanding these moves isn't just insight, it's your advantage in a world where leverage is everything.